So far, we've been defining our functions using what are called function statements, where we have function and then some, I don't know, let's go with add, and then we return something or we do something in here. But the pattern is function and then a name and then curly braces. Now I'm going to show you a completely different syntax. Although I say completely different, it looks very similar, but it is different. It's called a function expression. This is another way of defining a function. These functions will work just as well, just the same as the function statements we've been writing, but there's a key difference here. If you look at this function, it's stored in a variable. The function itself does not have a name. It's not function square, then parens. I'm saying function, no name, and I'm storing it in a variable square. Now, how am I able to store a function in a variable? Well, it works because functions are objects. In JavaScript, functions are objects, which means we can put them in a variable. We can store 10 of them in an array. We can even pass them around as arguments, which is something we do all the time, and it's mainly why I'm introducing this to you right now. So I have a variable called square. It could be holding a number, it could be holding an array, but instead it's holding a function, which is just an object. And to call it, I reference the name of the variable square, and I pass in an argument just like I would for any function named square. The main distinction here is that the function does not actually have a name. It's stored in a variable, but we haven't provided a name. So let's try one of these out on our own. We can write a regular function statement first. So function, we'll just do add, I know it's boring, but x and y, 2 parameters, and then we'll return x plus y. Now let's define a function expression that does the same thing. So we could write it with no name. I'm not going to store it in a variable first. I'm just going to write function, parentheses, x comma y, return x plus y. Now this on its own is not valid. If I save, we can't call this. We have no way of referring to this function. There's no name. I haven't stored it in a variable. This is called an anonymous function. And we do use these a lot, but not just on their own floating in the middle of nowhere. We usually pass them into another function, but I'm getting ahead of myself. So let's store this in a variable. I'll call this one sum instead of add, so I don't have 2 adds, and I'll save. So to execute add, I just reference add, and I'll pass in some numbers like 4 and 5, I get 9. To execute sum, it's the same thing, I just reference sum. So sum 9 and 3 gives us 12. They work exactly the same way, but we declared them in 2 different formats, 2 different syntaxes. There are some differences between how these behave, which is something we will address in time. We'll talk about something called hoisting, but for now, all you need to know is that this is another syntax to define a function, and that functions are objects, which means we can store them in a variable, pass them around, put them in arrays. They're just like any other object. Now this also means that we can inspect them. If I do a console.dir, which we may not have seen very much of, or may not have seen it yet at all. If I do console.dir of sum, it's going to print out the object form. It kind of reveals the underlying object, and I can see things like the name of the function. Also, we can just tell it's an object. We have key value pairs. If I do the same thing, console.dir of add, this is kind of like proof that it's an object. I mean, it's just the Chrome console showing us some data, but we can see the underlying key and value properties here. Okay, the last thing I'll show you is that you can add in a name for a function when you're storing it in a variable. It doesn't have to be anonymous. So this function right here, the part I have highlighted, has no name. We're storing it in a variable called sum, but the function itself does not have a name. I can write another function. Let's call this one product, meaning multiplication, equals function, and then I can give it a name still, multiply x and y, return x times y. So this is valid here. This is still a function expression, but it's a named function expression. This is anonymous. We'll talk later about this name and if it really means anything, if it's useful ever. There's a couple situations where it might matter. But the point right now is just that we can add a name, and to call this function, I still call product. Product of 3 and 5 gives me 15. If I try and call multiply, my console doesn't know about it. It's not trying to autocomplete. 3 and 5, it doesn't work. But don't get too caught up in these details. I just hope that the one takeaway here should be that you can define a function using this format where we write a function expression, we store it in a variable. And we're learning this right now for a reason, because we're about to see how we can start passing around functions to other functions, how we can use them as values. There's a lot that we can do because of the fact that functions are objects. We can pass them around, we can store them, and this is just the tip of the iceberg. So a function expression is another way of defining a function. The syntax is almost identical, but we use a variable, equal sign, function. We can optionally leave off the name. Otherwise, we still write our parameters, we still use them, we still return something, and we still call them the same way.